The biggest story that the world is tracking today, the strikes on Syria. After days of suspense, US President Donald Trump today ordered military strikes against the Assad regime in that country. Allies France and the United Kingdom joined American forces to carry out these strikes in homes in Damascus. Syrian research, storage and military targets have been destroyed. This move is an attempt, we are told, to punish Syrian President Bashar al-Assad for a suspected chemical attack in Douma last weekend. That left more than 70 people dead, including children. A scientific research center in Greater Damascus and 2 chemical weapons facilities west of Homs were struck. The research center in Damascus was reportedly used to produce weapons, while the facility in Homs was reportedly used to produce nerve agent sarin.
My fellow Americans, a short time ago, I ordered the United States Armed Forces to launch precision strikes on targets associated with the chemical weapons capabilities of Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad. A combined operation with the armed forces of France and the United Kingdom is now underway. We thank them both.
U.S. Defense Secretary James Mattis has called the strikes a one-time event, saying that there are no additional attacks planned.
The strike tonight separately demonstrates international resolve to prevent chemical weapons from being used on anyone under any circumstance in contravention of international law. I want to emphasize that these strikes are directed at the Syrian regime. In conducting these strikes, we have gone to great lengths to avoid civilian and foreign casualties. But it is a time for all civilized nations to urgently unite in ending the Syrian civil war by supporting the United Nations-backed Geneva peace process.
Meanwhile, UK Prime Minister Theresa May strongly backed the US airstrikes, saying that it was the only alternative left to deter Syria from using chemical weapons further.
This evening, I have authorised British armed forces to conduct coordinated and targeted strikes to degrade the Syrian regime's chemical weapons capability and deter their use. We are acting together with our American and French allies. In Douma last Saturday, a chemical weapons attack killed up to 75 people, including young children, in circumstances of pure horror. The fact of this attack should surprise no one.
Let's go straight to WION's West Asia Bureau Chief Daniele Pagani, who's been holding fort in that region for us and bringing us the very latest on the ground. Daniele, first of all, was this a fixed match is the question we're asking. If Russia was in the know, if Damascus had already been tipped off, if those facilities had been evacuated, what were these strikes all about?
If this was a fixed match, and it seems it was very close to a fixed match, let's not exaggerate, there will be no effect if you have a look at the situation on the ground as of now. The situation is majorly unchanged. The Syrian army is exactly where it was. None of its premises, equipment, personnel has been affected by this latest airstrike. The same goes for Russian army's equipment and tools and for Iranian interest in the region. So as a matter of the war in Syria, nothing changes as of now. Also, despite the Pentagon this very morning, when we were listening together to the press conference, said that they have not communicated anything to the Russians, they have not communicated the targets to the Russians. It seems that, going by the words of the French Minister of Defense, Le Drian, that actually is not the case, because he says that Russia was warned beforehand, and therefore they knew what could have been the possible targets. While the dust settles and we try to understand what we can say right now is that this was a highly symbolic attack, but militarily it does not hit to any extent the Russians, the Iranians or the Syrian army as of now.
The next question, Daniele, is will there be retaliation? To what degree and by whom? Tehran or Moscow? What are the indications currently?
The last update that we have is that the President of Russia, Vladimir Putin, requested an emergency meeting for the United Nations Security Council. This is a much expected move. As far as I am concerned, and given the elements that we have as of now, it is very hard that there will be a military retaliation. Why I say so? Moscow specified that none of the attack reached anywhere close to any of the military premises they have. Tehran very vocally said that they will retaliate elsewhere in the region, but they have absolutely no military chance to attack directly the United States in West Asia, which is by far the largest, most powerful and most effective military force on the ground, not only on the ground, even on the air and on the sea. When it comes to the Syrian government alone, the Syrian government, there is, I would say, nothing it can do, at least militarily, to retaliate against the United States. And also, none of these actors would, as of now, take the responsibility of directly attacking.
Right, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Daniele. UK Prime Minister Theresa May making a statement. Let's listen in.
Storm Shadow missiles at a military facility some 15 miles west of Homs, where the regime is assessed to keep chemical weapons in breach of Syria's obligations under the Chemical Weapons Convention. While the full assessment of the strike is ongoing, we are confident of its success. Let me set out why we have taken this action. Last Saturday, up to 75 people, including young children, were killed in a despicable and barbaric attack in Douma, with as many as 500 further casualties. We have worked with our allies to establish what happened, and all the indications are that this was a chemical weapons attack. We have seen the harrowing images of men, women and children lying dead with foam in their mouths. These were innocent families who, at the time this chemical weapon was unleashed, were seeking shelter underground in basements. First-hand accounts from NGOs and aid workers have detailed the most horrific suffering, including burns to the eyes, suffocation and skin discoloration, with a chlorine-like odour surrounding the victims. And the World Health Organization has received reports that hundreds of patients arrived at Syrian health facilities on Saturday night with signs and symptoms consistent with exposure to toxic chemicals. We are also clear about who was responsible for this atrocity. A significant body of information, including intelligence, indicates the Syrian regime is responsible for this latest attack. I cannot tell you everything, but let me give an example of some of the evidence that leads us to this conclusion. Open source accounts allege that a barrel bomb was used to deliver the chemicals. Multiple open source reports claim that a regime helicopter was observed above the city of Douma on the evening of the 7th of April. The opposition does not operate helicopters or use barrel bombs. And reliable intelligence indicates that Syrian military officials coordinated what appears to be the use of chlorine in Douma on the 7th of April. No other group could have carried out this attack. Indeed, Daesh, for example, does not even have a presence in Douma. And the fact of this attack should surprise no one. We know that the Syrian regime has an utterly abhorrent record of using chemical weapons against its own people. On the 21st of August 2013, over 800 people were killed and thousands more injured in a chemical attack also in Ghouta. There were 14 further smaller-scale chemicals attacks prior to that summer. At Khan Sheikhoun on the 4th of April last year, the Syrian regime used sarin against its people, killing around 100 with a further 500 casualties. And based on the regime's persistent pattern of behaviour and the cumulative analysis of specific incidents, we judge it highly likely both that the Syrian regime has continued to use chemical weapons since then and will continue to do so. This must be stopped. We have sought to do so using every possible diplomatic channel, but our efforts have been repeatedly thwarted, both on the ground and in the United Nations. Following the sarin attack in eastern Damascus back in August 2013, the Syrian regime committed to dismantle its chemical weapon programme, and Russia promised to ensure that Syria did this, overseen by the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. But these commitments have not been met. A recent report from the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons has said that Syria's declaration of its former chemical weapons programme is incomplete. This indicates that it continues to retain undeclared stocks of nerve agent or precursor chemicals and is likely to be continuing with some chemical weapons production. The OPCW inspectors have investigated previous attacks and on 4 occasions decided that the regime was indeed responsible. And on each occasion, when we have seen every sign of chemical weapons being used, any attempt to hold the perpetrators to account has been blocked by Russia at the UN Security Council, with 6 such vetoes since the start of 2017. Just this week, the Russians vetoed a draft resolution that would have established an independent investigation into this latest attack, even making the grotesque and absurd claim that it was staged by Britain. So we have no choice but to conclude that diplomatic action on its own will not be any more effective in the future than it has been in the past. Over the last week, the UK government has been working intensively with our international partners to build the evidence picture and to consider what action we need to take to prevent and deter future humanitarian catastrophes caused by chemical weapons attacks. When the Cabinet met on Thursday, we considered the advice of the Attorney General, the National Security Advisor and the Chief of the Defence Staff, and we were updated on the latest assessment and intelligence picture. And based on this advice, we agreed that it was both right and legal to take military action, together with our closest allies, to alleviate further humanitarian suffering by degrading the Syrian regime's chemical weapons capability and deterring their use. This was not about interfering in a civil war, and it was not about regime change. As I discussed with President Trump and President Macron, it was a limited, targeted and effective strike with clear boundaries that expressly sought to avoid escalation and did everything possible to prevent civilian casualties. Together, we have hit a specific and limited set of targets. They were a chemical weapons storage and production facility, a key chemical weapons research centre, and a military bunker involved in chemical weapons attacks. Hitting these targets with the force that we have deployed will significantly degrade the Syrian regime's ability to research, develop and deploy chemical weapons. A year ago, after the atrocity at Khan Sheikhoun, the US conducted a strike on the airfield from which the attack took place. But Assad and his regime hasn't stopped their use of chemical weapons. So last night's strikes by the US, UK and France were significantly larger than the US action a year ago and specifically designed to have a greater impact on the regime's capability and willingness to use chemical weapons. And this collective action sends a clear message that the international community will not stand by and tolerate the use of chemical weapons. I also want to be clear that this military action to deter the use of chemical weapons does not stand alone. We must remain committed to resolving the conflict at large. The best hope for the Syrian people remains a political solution. We need all partners, especially the regime and its backers, to enable humanitarian access to those in desperate need, and the UK will continue to strive for both. But these strikes are about deterring the barbaric use of chemical weapons in Syria and beyond. And so to achieve this, there must also be a wider diplomatic effort, including the full range of political and economic levers, to strengthen the global norms prohibiting the use of chemical weapons, which have stood for nearly a century. Although of a much lower order of magnitude, the use of a nerve agent on the streets of the UK in recent weeks is part of a pattern of disregard for these norms. So while this action is specifically about deterring the Syrian regime, It will also send a clear signal to anyone else who believes they can use chemical weapons with impunity. There is no graver decision for a Prime Minister than to commit our forces to combat. And this is the first time that I have had to do so. As always, they have served our country with the greatest professionalism and bravery, and we owe them a huge debt of gratitude. We would have preferred an alternative path, but on this occasion there is none. We cannot allow the use of chemical weapons to become normalised, either within Syria, on the streets of the UK or elsewhere. We must reinstate the global consensus that chemical weapons cannot be used. This action is absolutely in Britain's national interest. The lesson of history is that when the global rules and standards that keep us safe come under threat, we must take a stand and defend them. That is what our country has always done, and that is what we will continue to do. I'll take a number of questions. Let me start with Laura.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Laura Kunsberg, BBC News. Your logic is that chemical attacks must not go unpunished. Will you do the same again if President Assad does the same again, as you have suggested he has? And do you feel you have the public's consent, given that you have not even consulted MPs in Parliament?
As I said in my statement, the purpose of the action that took place last night was to degrade and deter the capability and willingness of the Syrian regime to use chemical weapons. As I also said, obviously a full assessment has not yet been completed, but we believe that the action was successful. But the Syrian regime should be under no doubt of our resolve in relation to this matter of the use of chemical weapons. And I have taken this decision because I believe it is the right thing to do. I believe it is in our national interest, but I believe it is also important for the international community to be very clear about this issue, that we have seen people appearing to think that they can use chemical weapons with impunity. And we must restore the position of that, as I said, has existed for nearly a century, that the use of chemical weapons is illegal, it is banned, and we cannot accept it. Tim?
Thank you, Prime Minister. Tim Shipman from the Sunday Times. You were hinting towards the end of your statement there about possible further wider action against supporters of the regime. Can you explain why you haven't yet taken action against Russian money in London in the same way that the United States has? And on a linked point, we appear to be in a propaganda war with the Russians. Why have no ministers been out explaining what you've been explaining today throughout a week in which the Russian ambassador has been accusing Britain of culpability for the crimes that you've addressed this evening?
Well, on the first point, as you will know, Tim, and as I said in response to the use of the nerve agent on the streets of Salisbury, we are, of course, looking at every aspect of the action that can be taken. We do, in general, work against illicit finances, against criminal finances here in the UK, and we will continue to do so. You say that no minister has been out over the past week. I've given 2 television interviews over the past week in which I've set out the need for action and the need for us to restore the international norm of the recognition that chemical weapons should not be used. What I said in those interviews was that we were working with our international partners and allies to make the fullest possible assessment of what happened on the ground, and then to ascertain what action was necessary. We've done that, and the action that we saw last night into the early hours of this morning was the result of that work. Adam.
Prime Minister, I wonder if you could explain a little more your decision and your thinking on not seeking prior approval or debate from Parliament on this decision, because, as you know, Jeremy Corbyn and on the other side Kenneth Clarke have both said that they feel that that should have taken place, and there seems to be a feeling abroad that Tony Blair set a precedent back in 2003.
Well, as I said, as I've just said, I believe that this action was necessary. I believe it was the right thing for us to do. We have been working with our allies and partners over the past week, first to make the fullest possible assessment of what happened on the ground, and then to consider what action was necessary, and to do that in a timely fashion so that we could act with sufficient understanding of what had happened on the ground and proper planning of any action, but to do so within a timescale that gave a very clear message to the regime. And it was also important, and I believe it is important, as we are sending, it is one of the gravest decision that a Prime Minister can take is to send our service personnel into action, into combat. And when we do that, we owe it to them that we, as far as possible, protect their safety and their security. And for operational security reasons, it was right that we've acted in the way that we did. Properly plan this, assess what happened on the ground, properly plan it, act within a timescale that's right to both protect operational security and give a very clear message to the regime. Robert?
You explicitly linked the overnight action to the poisonings in Salisbury. Was the overnight action just about Assad, or was it explicitly a warning to Russia as well? The Secretary-General is warning that the Cold War is back, and he is fearful we don't have the institutional structures to contain it. How do we restore a sense of calm and security?
Well, first of all, I referred to what happened in Salisbury, because it was the use of a chemical weapon, a nerve agent, on the streets of the United Kingdom. The action that took place last night was an action which was focused on degrading and deterring the operational capability and the willingness of the Syrian regime to continue to use chemical weapons. As I said, there have been many instances when we have seen them using those chemical weapons. But I believe it should also be a message to others that the international community is not going to stand by and allow chemical weapons to be used with impunity. We have, for nearly a century now, had a general understanding under the Chemical Weapons Convention that chemical weapons were illegal, that their use was banned. We have in recent times all too often seen chemical weapons being used. I think it's right that the international community has come together and said that we will not accept this, and given a very clear message about that we want to re-establish that international norm that chemical weapons are banned and should not be used. Yes.
Bénédicte Paviot, France 24. If chemical weapons are indeed used again in Syria, will the United Kingdom take part in more targeted strikes? And since, if it's in the coming weeks, Parliament will no longer be in recess, will you feel a bigger pressure to actually ask for that green light? And how important is it to you that President Macron is alongside and very much participating in this operation? How would you characterize the Franco-British entente about this operation?
Well, first of all, on the parliamentary front, and I apologise, I should have made reference to this in answer to the previous questions. I will be in Parliament on Monday to make a statement to Parliament and obviously to give parliamentarians the opportunity to question me about this. I believe it was right to take the action that we have done in the timing that we have done, as I've indicated, in relation to assessment, planning and operational security. But it was to send a very clear message about the use of these chemical weapons. I believe that the action that's taken will have significantly degraded the capability of the Syrian regime to use chemical weapons. We want to deter their willingness to use chemical weapons as well, but they should be in no doubt of our resolve, and I believe that is an international resolve on these issues, to ensure that we do return to the situation where it is accepted that the use of chemical weapons is illegal, is banned, they should not be used. I think, obviously, this has been a tripartite operation with the United States, with France and the United Kingdom. You asked specifically about the Franco-British relationship. I think we have a very good and close relationship on security and defence matters. That was enhanced in the summit the Franco-British summit we had earlier this year. We have been over recent years working increasingly closely together on these defence matters.